All right, guys, so today we are going to be continuing on with our study of forensics and forensic botany. And we're going to be adding a few more fields to it. So we're going to also be looking into forensic anthropology, forensic archaeology, forensic geoscience, and forensic biology. And we're going to see how all of these work together in order to investigate suspicious events that may occur. So you'll be taking on the role of all 5 of these different experts. You're going to be filling out 2 activity sheets partially through our assignment here. And you'll have about 2 days to do the entire thing. So to get you into the mindset of what you're going to be doing, try to imagine that a skull with pieces of skin and hair attached has been found in the attic of an old house. The current owner of the house has no idea where the skull came from, so a forensic team has been asked to investigate. So here are the skulls that you would be seeing. And you can see there's a little bit of skin, you can see there's some bone, and up here there's definitely some hair there. You're going to be presented with 3 different people, 3 profiles for these individuals, and you're going to see which one most closely would match the mystery skull. Your task is to determine the origin of that skull. So I have the worksheets for you in both a PDF form and also in Kami. I put it in a PDF just in case Kami isn't working. That way you can still view everything. You'll just have to create your own Google Doc and then email that to me instead. So the first sheet that you would be filling in is this one here. It's called Analyzing the Evidence, and it's part 1. I have the experts labeled A, B, C, D, and E, and you'll be telling me what method they used and what clues and conclusions you were able to reach from that method. Each method should be explained in full, and the clues and conclusions should include all information provided by the scientist that you believe would be valuable. You can also add some of your own conclusions if you can draw any from the evidence. So I'll read through these different reports, and then I'll give you an example. All of your information is going to be found here in this PowerPoint. So the first expert report is the forensic archaeologist, and they used the method of radiocarbon dating. This method is based on measuring 2 isotopes, atomic forms of carbon in a plant or animal, rare radioactive carbon-14 and common stable carbon-12. As long as a plant or animal is alive, its ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 matches the ratio in the atmosphere. This relationship occurs because both forms of carbon are constantly being replaced when plants absorb carbon during photosynthesis, the process of making food from sunlight and carbon dioxide. The same carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio is preserved when animals eat plants. After death, however, carbon-14 breaks down without being replaced. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 changes at a predictable rate, with half of the carbon-14 disappearing after a half-life of about 5,700 years. In other words, because carbon-14 decays, we can estimate the length of time since the organism has died based on the changes of the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. If the ratio is 1/2 of the atmospheric ratio, we can conclude that the organism died approximately 5,700 years ago. To find out the age of the skull, I sent one of the vertebrae pieces of the backbone that had been separated from the neck to a specialized lab for radiocarbon dating. The results show that the owner of this skull died between 4,730 and 4,850 years ago. The confidential evidence for this range is 95%. The confidence level, for this range is 95%. So they're pretty confident in those dates. In other words, 95% of samples tested would fall within the time range of 4,700 years to 4,850 years ago. They also did a DNA analysis, so they did 2 different methods. I used a DNA analysis to analyze the piece of skin attached to the skull. This method allows for us to look for distinctive patterns in the genetic material, the DNA, of any living or once living thing. The test showed that the skin is not human. Rather, it comes from a goat. So that's kind of interesting there. It comes from a goat. So whenever you would go back to your activity sheet here, you would want to put down the methods that they used, which is the radiocarbon dating, and you would want to also write down the DNA analysis, and then clues and conclusions about the skull. So what could you draw from either one of these two things? You could put down the timeline for death. So it would have been 4,730 years to 4,850 years ago. You could also put down that there was goat skin on it. It was not human skin that was found. And then you would want to move on to expert B, which is your forensic biologist. So I'll read through that one with you, but I'm going to have you guys do your own clues and conclusions about the skull. So they used the isotope analysis, and if you're wondering how I'm coming up with the methods, it's just what's up here in bold. I sent samples from a vertebrae, which is a piece of a backbone, that was loosely attached to the skull to a specialized lab for isotope analysis. This technique measures and compares the ratios of two stable isotopes, which are forms of carbon, carbon-12, and carbon-13, which is rare. Radioactive carbon-14 is not used in this analysis. Depending on how much carbon-13 they absorb during photosynthesis, the process plants use to make food from sunlight and carbon dioxide, different species are known as C3 or C4 plants. C3 plants include most temperate climate species, which is kind of where we live. We live in a temperate environment. And if you remember anything about photosynthesis, you'll know that there are three main pathways that plants can take. C3 is the most common. Then you have the C4 and the CAM pathways, which are based largely on environmental changes. So getting back into it here, we have the C3 plants include most temperate climates, include temperate species, including wheat, rice, and most types of trees. C4 plants originated in hot, sunny areas and were used in early agriculture. This group includes sugarcane, maize, which is corn, and sorghum. When humans and other animals eat C3 or C4 plants, the carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratios persist, and we can often gain important information about their diet and living conditions. The isotope analysis on bone gelatin from the vertebrae associated with this skull indicates that the diet of this person was largely based on foods from C4 plants. So make sure you put down isotope analysis, and then you're going to want to tell me, what did you learn from that isotope analysis? What were we able to conclude? I'll give you a hint, it's in this last sentence down here. Then you're going to move on to expert C, which is the forensic geoscientist. They used sediment analysis. I examined 5 pieces of sediment from the temporal fossa, the shallow indentations on each side of the skull. Analysis under a microscope showed that they included soft, powdery silt combined with plant fibers, rodent feces, and crushed fish scales. The mineral component resembles loess, a type of soil formed when wind-blown dust is deposited in blankets that can be over 100 meters deep. In some areas of northern China, South America, and southern United States, thick loess deposits cover hundreds of square kilometers. Loess tends to form tall cliffs that hold natural or human-made caves. And you can see they have the loess areas highlighted down there in that map. So in this one, we're learning about where the person could have maybe lived or resided. Expert D is our forensic botanist. They did a pollen analysis, which we've talked about before. I used a microscope to analyze pollen grains found in plant and soil samples from the nose and eye area, plus the temporal fossa, which is the shallow indentations on the sides of the skull. Because the pollen from each type of plant has a distinctive size and form, I was able to compare these grains to known samples and identify the plants they came from. Pollen of this family dominates the samples. This group of plants is typically found in poor, dry, or even salty soils, in deserts, prairies, and along seashore. I found clumps of pollen from grass, sage, sunflowers, and onions. We have one more profile left to read, and that is the forensic anthropologist. They did a dental analysis. Fortunately, the skull had a nearly complete set of teeth that provides us with many clues. The first thing I noticed in my examination was the pattern of wear on the molars. These back teeth are very flat and also worn down. Also, there is noticeable notching on the right canine tooth, and notching to a lesser extent on the left canine. The incisors show some shoveling, which is a scooping out on the tongue side that is usually found in people of Asian or Aboriginal American ancestry. Also, the molars lack the carabilis cusp, an additional bump that is commonly found on the teeth of people from European descent. Age and sex for the skull have not yet been determined. So when they're talking about notching on the teeth, that means that it's getting curved out a little bit. So you're kind of getting a gully in one of those teeth. And you want to think about what types of activities could potentially lead to notching of teeth. That would be if you use your teeth to bite a lot of things, not food, but if you use them to open containers up, or maybe you bite your nails or you bite threads, that type of thing is going to cause notching because that thread is probably going in the same area of that tooth. So eventually it's going to kind of wear out that portion of your tooth. People who would do notching would be usually women back in those days because they were often sewing a lot, or maybe even men who were creating fishing nets. They would do a lot of notching in their teeth as well. So that is it for the first part of this activity. You should have your entire part 1 filled out. So then you're going to move on to making a decision, which is part 2. Which prehistoric person, Anu, Spakwa, or Kara, is most likely a match for the mystery skull? Record each piece of evidence in the appropriate column. Next to each piece of evidence, rate its strength using stars. I should say stars. So 1 star is going to be fairly weak evidence, 3 stars is going to be stronger evidence. State and justify your conclusion about the most likely identity of the skull. So you can see the first person names here is Anu, and these are all clues about that individual. You're going to write down the experts' supporting evidence for why it could be Anu and their contrary evidence for why it could not be Anu, and it's all just based around what fact they're giving you here. Please take note that these profiles are fictional and there may be more than one really good choice. Also, some of the descriptions presented in the profiles may not directly correspond with any available expert evidence. So you might be running into some of these and say, well, I don't have any supporting evidence or contrary evidence for this. And then you may have only supporting evidence for one clue or only contrary evidence for one clue. You're going to be giving examples. So if we had a clue here, let's just Say, for example, the guy's name was Jack, and we said Jack is a nice person. That would be our clue. Supporting evidence for him being a nice person would be me writing something like Jack hugs his mother every morning. Contrary evidence would be me saying that he sometimes kicks his dog. That would go against him being a nice person. So you'll go through, you'll read the clues, give your evidence. Spakwa is below that one, and Kara is below that one, and you'll tell me who do you think it is and your reasoning behind choosing that person. So for Anu, he was a male. He was born about 4,830 years ago. He died of pneumonia around the age of 47. He lived in what is now the Rocha region of Uruguay. His people planned towns and constructed large earth mounds that were probably used for burial and ceremonial purposes. His family grew corn, squash, and beans near their home. He fished in the ocean using large nets. For Spakwa, she was a female born about 4,760 years ago. She died in childbirth around the age of 21. She lived in a cave on the banks of the Mississippi River, which is present-day Louisiana. She lived with a clan of approximately 300 people. Her people had started to sow seeds and harvest crops such as maize and sunflowers. She made pottery and baskets to hold food and tools. And our last profile is Kara. She was a female born around 4,680 years ago. She died of starvation around the age of 32. She lived in the area now known as the Inner Mongolia region of northern China. She had a nomadic lifestyle with about 30 minutes of extended family, with about 30 probably individuals who were extended family plus domesticated horses and other animals. Her diet was largely based on meat and milk products. She used animal hides and wool to make clothes and portable homes called yurts. Once you are finished with that, please turn it in and we will move on to our next case.